Welcome, I'm Yvonne, and here's what happened this week. President Legislature has called on the public to pay more attention to legislative reforms. It follows the passage of several controversial bills that could give the legislature more power. Rick Glower reports on how the reforms has split Taiwan society.
Cheers of support and shouts of protests in Taiwan's legislature as it passes contentious reforms giving Parliament more power. Bills that have caused weeks of violence here in the legislature and mass protests on the streets of Taiwan.
We wanted to rebalance the powers of the executive and legislature, and so we can refine our democracy.
The reforms, once signed into law by the president, would give lawmakers the power to compel information from officials and citizens, criminalise contempt of parliament for officials, and require the president to report to the legislature and answer questions. Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party says it is an overreach of power. They accuse the opposition parties of not following due process in the parliament and say they are making Taiwan vulnerable to Chinese infiltration.
你们把国会没收了，把民主没收了，接下去当然是台湾香港化。
The DPP, which won the presidency in January elections but lost control of the legislature, has promised to reject the changes and take them to the Constitutional Court. The high political drama has split society, with tens of thousands taking to the streets around Parliament.
它并没有完全的实践民主价值。如果以后都可以用这样的方式来通过法案的话，我可能真的会对台湾的民主越来越没有信心。
Taiwan prides itself in its democracy and says these values are what makes the country different from autocratic China across the strait. These contested reforms have exasperated deep schisms in the legislature and in public opinion. And for Taiwan's new president, Legislature, who's now just 10 days into the role, it's a bitter taste of the challenges to come in the next 4 years. Chris Ma and Rick Glower for TaiwanPlus.
And to understand why the opposition proposed these reforms, Irene Ling spoke to Alexander Tan, professor of political science at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand.
Why are the opposition parties, the Kuomintang or KMT and Taiwan People's Party TPP, are rushing these reforms right now?
The only reason I can think of is the fact that they have the numbers. I guess with the election result from January, with the split executive branch, legislative branch, you kind of have an expectation that from a parliamentary strategy themselves, they would be pushing these type of things, at least the two of them, right? Because there's no assurance that the TPP and the KMT will always be together. So I guess for them, it seems like this is a project, so to speak, that is, I would say, a low-hanging fruit for them.
What does the opposition think the bills can bring to Taiwanese society?
What it is trying to bring, at least my understanding of it, is a little bit more balance in the executive-legislative relations, so to speak. As you know, Taiwan has a semi-presidential system wherein the executive branch definitely is stronger than the legislative branch. It's quite unlike the system of the United States presidential system, wherein you have a strong legislature as such, and the check and balance is much more evenly keeled. Semi-presidential systems tend to favor the executive branch more than the legislative branch. So one can say that this is an attempt, whether it's awkward, it's clunky, I don't know.
So the DPP and the anti-reform protesters are worried that the checks and balances that you mentioned would be disrupted now that the legislature may breach other branches' authorities. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily overreach. Yes, we have that Taiwan has a five-power system, which is, in the scheme of global political system is quite unique, to be honest. But whether it encroaches on the control yuan's authority, I can't say. I think I will leave that for the Constitutional Court and the justices to interpret if the DPP or the government decides to bring this case over, right? Whether it's an overreach in the sense of the legislature. But if you look at it from a parliamentary perspective, then it's normal behavior by Parliament to be able to exert some control, or at least have some control of the executive.
That was Alexander Tan from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand speaking to Irene Lin about Taiwan's recent legislative reforms. China's large military drills around Taiwan last week raised alarms both in the country and internationally. But as Chris Gorin reports, those living on Taiwan's Kinmen Islands near China may have slightly different concerns.
66-year-old Li Kai-chen is fighting to keep a tradition alive. He's an oyster farmer on Taiwan's outlying Kinmen Islands, which sit within eyesight of the Chinese city of Xiamen. He tends to oyster beds made of granite stones, brought to Kinmen from China more than 400 years ago. And right next to them, anti-landing spikes, installed to ward off a Chinese invasion, on the site of a long-ago battle in the Chinese Civil War.
在真正大家都为了一方面为了性命就是往外跑科田就是荒废一阵子，然后等战争过后，我们又回来，再重新再整理科田。
Then, as now, these oyster farms are at the front lines of growing tensions between Taiwan and China, a fact they are constantly reminded of, whether by Chinese propaganda calling for unification or by Chinese military exercises around the island. Just last week, China launched a series of drills around Taiwan and its outlying islands, including Kinmen, encircling the islands with Coast Guard and Navy ships. But these oyster farmers are used to Chinese military activity and say they aren't worried about an invasion, but rather that their traditional oyster farming practices could die out.
船不会靠过来，因为有那个海巡队的在这边给他追，他不能靠近我们的岸线。
就是一些沿海的工商业发达开发过度就是把这个科田都就慢慢消失了。就是说，这个百年科田，它其实它不只代表的不是一个食物，它代表了一个文化，还有一个历史。
For the farmers, having good relations with China isn't just about politics. Chinese tourists have been a key source of the island's income, but they've been prevented by Beijing from visiting the island since 2019. In spite of all the cross-strait tensions, Li is hoping that will change.
希望能够陆客多一点进来，让我们的生意可以做，老百姓相对就有那个收入可以提那个生活就能够改善改善目前的生活。
With fewer people practicing traditional oyster farming and geopolitical tensions keeping tourists away, communities like Li's are faced with an existential dilemma and left hoping for a lifeline. Devin Tsai and Chris Gorin for TaiwanPlus.
The Transport Ministry says the ban on Taiwanese tour groups visiting China will remain in place. But tours organized when the ban was briefly suspended last year will be allowed to proceed. Taiwan imposed a ban on group tours to China in 2019 after Beijing stopped allowing tourism to Taiwan. However, Taiwan has gone along with the Beijing-led initiative to open travel between China's Fujian province and Taiwan's Mazu Islands. Taiwan's Transportation Ministry says it will continue to open travel on a reciprocal basis. China is canceling preferential import duties on over 100 Taiwanese goods. Affected items include lubricating oils and other chemical products. China had reduced duties on these products as a part of a trade deal with Taiwan in 2010. But China says Taiwan has imposed what it calls discriminatory bans and restrictions on Chinese products. China and Taiwan have seen heightened trade friction on top of political and military tensions in recent years. China has banned a range of Taiwanese goods, including chemicals and agricultural products. The recent death of 2 firefighters in the line of duty has given new energy to calls for a firefighters union. It's also got firefighters demanding greater protections to stop accidents on the job, John Ventrias reports.
A moment of silence as the names of Taiwan's latest fallen firefighters are added to a list going back a decade. Li Yongzhen and Zhou Lixin ran back into a building in the northwestern city of Hsinchu early Monday, trying to reach trapped people when they were overtaken by smoke. This gathering of firefighters is determined their deaths won't be for nothing. Outside the legislature, they're taking aim at the government.
都要等到殉职案发生，才稍稍的会回应我们。然后我们提出的消防改革诉求，还要被打折，还要被妥协。难道这些消防员的生命是可以被妥协的吗？
As civil servants, Taiwan's firefighters aren't allowed to form unions, and they're not covered under Taiwan's health and safety laws. This group, the National Association for Firefighters' Rights, argues this first point means firefighters are unable to negotiate for better conditions and equipment. And it says the second leaves firefighters exposed to simple workplace accidents.
在过往，我们都是用一般的工程梯，但是工程梯它的使用限制啊，还有它的负重啊，其实都不能足以就是应付我们的救灾的工作。那所以在几年前有人因为使用工程梯受伤，但是我们的政府完全没有针对这个部分去做检讨，也没有去调查，然后导致说现在大部分的政府的消防局的半数以上的消防分队都还在使用工程梯。
消防员的命，消防员决定，消防员决定。
Firefighters' demands for a union and legal workplace protections are far from new. Protests like this one have been going on for over half a year since an even more fatal blaze. But the most recent deaths have put new energy into a push to get both. And these firefighters reject the government's alternative proposals.
执政党没有听见我们的声音。 治安的部分，装备的汰换、保养、检修、维护，分队驻地设施的完善的安全，消防专业的分工，各式抢救原则的严格落实，还有完善，这些都是属于治安的一部分。 我们看到执政党提出来的草案，里面完全没有。
Taiwan's two opposition parties have yet to lend their support either, but there have been signs of sympathy from both, and crucially, they now hold a majority in the legislature. The firefighters here haven't heard of concrete plans to help their cause, but they're hoping someone inside the chamber is listening. Klein Wang and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
Government officials have signaled they might be open to continuing nuclear power in Taiwan. The National Development Council says if a consensus is reached in the government, it would not rule out continuing using nuclear energy. The council says the development of AI technology is expected to put strain on the country's energy supply. It says nuclear energy could help stabilize electricity supplies, reduce carbon emissions, and help meet Taiwan's 2050 net zero goal. Taiwan plans to begin shutting down its last operational nuclear power plant in July. A Taipei court has ruled that a transgender man can change his gender marker on identification documents without undergoing surgery. Taiwan law requires trans people to have a gender-affirming operation and psychological assessment before they can legally change gender. But rights groups say this is unfair and have been taking cases to court. The court previously ruled in favor of a transgender woman. Thursday's ruling does not set a precedent, but activists say it's an important step forward for LGBTQ+ rights.
法院直接命户政单位必须要为这个当事人变更性别，是一个非常好的一个结果。希望能够引领着后面更多的胜诉判决，但是对我们来说最重要的这个函释能够尽快的把它变更。
Thank you for watching Here's What Happened. Before we go, check out this rare sighting of an endangered whale shark in the waters off Taiwan's Pengfu Islands. I'm Yvonne Young, take care, and I'll see you next time.